The stone was still warm from his youngest boy's hand when Florence Prescott found it on her pillow, and that small, smooth weight cracked something open inside her chest that she had spent 3 years learning to keep sealed shut. She stood in the doorway of the spare room at the Monroe Ranch, the lantern light catching the river stone's damp gray surface, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum as though she could hold herself together through sheer pressure alone. It was the third night, the third stone. Each one placed with the same quiet deliberateness, the same wordless offering, and she had not once seen the boy do it. He was 8 years old and he moved through the house like a ghost, like something still learning whether it had the right to take up space. She picked it up. It fit perfectly in the cup of her palm, and that was when Clarence Monroe appeared in the hallway behind her, his boots making no sound on the bare pine boards, and she heard his breath catch the moment he saw what she was holding. She turned. His face in the lamplight was devastated in the way that only men who have spent years hiding their devastation can be, the expression there and then swiftly shuddered, replaced with the careful neutrality he wore like armor. "You found it," he said. It was not a question. "It is the third one," Florence said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Clarence, who taught him to do this?" He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that had a weight to it, a dark past pressing up behind it. She watched his jaw tighten, watched him look away toward the far wall where a woman's portrait used to hang. She knew because she could still see the faint rectangle of cleaner paint where it had been removed. "His mother," Clarence said finally. "She used to leave stones on the windowsill for him, one for every day she promised she would come back." Florence felt the floor shift under her feet. Not literally, but in the way that revelations do, when a hidden motive suddenly illuminates an entire landscape you thought you understood and reveals it to be entirely different. "She did not come back," Florence said softly. "No," Clarence said. "She did not." And there it was, the trap of it. The terrible, beautiful trap of being in this house, in this man's orbit, holding his youngest son's grief in the palm of her hand shaped like a smooth river stone. Florence Prescott had come to Redemption, Texas as a schoolteacher, not as anyone's salvation. She had her own dark past, her own secrets she had ridden hard and far to leave behind. She had not come here to fall in love. She had not come here to become the keeper of someone else's kept promises. But here she was, and here he was, and the stone was warm. It was the spring of 1883 when Florence Prescott stepped off the stage line in Redemption, Texas, and the town did its level best to disappoint her immediately. She had read the advertisement in the Dallas newspaper 3 times before answering it, turning the words over like a stone herself, testing their weight. Qualified schoolteacher sought for the township of Redemption, Callahan County, Texas. Suitable accommodation provided. Salary negotiable. The county seat had been offering the position for 2 years without filling it, which should have told her something. The advertisement had a quality of desperation to it that she recognized, because she had felt that same desperation herself, packing her 2 carpet bags in the rented room in Austin before dawn, leaving no forwarding address, telling no one where she was going. She was 26 years old, and she had spent those 26 years becoming accomplished at surviving things she was not supposed to survive. Redemption was a town of perhaps 400 souls stretched along a creek bed in the flat scrubland west of Abilene. The main street had a general store, a post office, a church, a saloon called the Dusty Bird, a livery stable, and a barbershop that also served as the town's de facto bank. There were 2 streets running perpendicular to the main one, both lined with clapboard houses in varying states of optimism. The schoolhouse sat at the north end of town, its white paint peeling with a kind of dignified resignation. The stage driver set her bags on the boardwalk and tipped his hat and left without offering to help her carry them, which was fine. Florence was accustomed to carrying her own weight. She was standing there, squinting into the afternoon sun, her dark hair already escaping from its pins after 12 hours of rattling roads, when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her and a voice said, "Miss Prescott." She turned. Clarence Monroe was not what she expected, though she could not have articulated what she had expected. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who work rather than men who merely present themselves as working. His hair was dark with a thread of gray at the temples, though she would later learn he was only 32, and his face was the kind of face that had clearly once been easy to read, and had then been through something that taught it to be careful. He held his hat in his hand. His eyes were a particular shade of brown that she would spend considerable time afterward trying to classify, before giving up and simply accepting that they were his eyes, and that was sufficient. "I am Clarence Monroe," he said. "I sit on the school board. I apologize for the committee's absence. There was a situation with Harlan Bickle's bull and 3 fences, and they got called away." "A situation," Florence repeated. "The bull is very committed to freedom," Clarence said, and she saw the ghost of something almost like humor cross his face and then retreat. "I see," Florence said, "and you drew the short straw for meeting the stage." "I volunteered," he said, which surprised her enough that she did not respond for a moment. He picked up both her bags without asking and nodded up the street. "The Hendersons have a room for you. Bertha Henderson runs a clean house and charges a fair price. The schoolhouse has been aired out. You start Monday." He told her all of this as they walked, and she noticed that he spoke in the manner of a man who chooses his words deliberately, not because he has few of them, but because he has learned to be careful with them. She also noticed, with the trained awareness of a woman who had survived things, that he kept a precise and respectful distance on the narrow boardwalk, and that when a man coming the other direction forced them closer together, Clarence shifted to put himself between her and the stranger without making a production of it. She filed this away. "You have children," she said. It was not a question. She had done her preparation. The school board correspondence had mentioned enrollment numbers, had listed Monroe, W. Monroe, E. Monroe, P. among the 31 students she would be teaching. 3 boys, he said. Walter is 14, Edgar is 11, and Perry is 8. Perry. She would later learn this was the youngest, the one with the river stones. But in that first afternoon walking up the main street of Redemption, she only noted the names, and the fact that Clarence Monroe did not say them the way some fathers said their children's names, like a list, like an obligation. He said them the way you say the names of things that matter more than you know how to express. Their mother. Florence asked because she needed to know professionally the domestic circumstances of her students. Clarence was quiet for 3 steps. "She left," he said, 2 years ago. She is living in San Antonio now, I am told." Florence did not ask anything further. She recognized the shape of that kind of pain, and she knew you did not press on it in the first conversation. The Henderson house was clean as promised, and Bertha Henderson was a stout, bright-eyed woman of 50, who seemed to have decided within 4 minutes of Florence's arrival that she approved of her. She fed Florence a supper of salt pork and cornbread, and told her everything worth knowing about Redemption in 45 minutes of cheerful narration, including the fact that Clarence Monroe was the best man in the county and the most stubborn, and that those 2 qualities were inseparable, and that his boys were half wild from missing their mother, but had good hearts under the wildness, especially the youngest, Perry, who was a strange and quiet child but who had a way of watching people that made you feel he was seeing more than you intended to show. Florence listened. She always listened. Information was the only currency she had ever been able to accumulate reliably. She started school on Monday. The Monroe boys arrived together, which she noticed, Walter steering the younger 2 through the schoolhouse door with the automatic authority of a boy who has been parenting his brothers for 2 years without being asked. Edgar was loud and good-natured, and immediately began a negotiation with the boy beside him about the relative merits of different pocket-knife brands. Perry walked in last, stopped inside the door, and looked directly at Florence with those dark eyes that were so like his father's it made something pull in her chest. And then he chose a desk in the middle row, not too close and not too far. the desk of a child who has learned to assess situations before committing to them. The first week was chaos calibrated with chaos, 31 children ranging from 6 to 15, varying levels of prior education, one cracked slate board, and a stove that smoked when the wind came from the south. Florence was good at her work. She had always been good at her work. It was one of the things she could trust about herself. By Friday, she had learned all 31 names, assessed each student's level, organized the older children into helping groups, and fixed the stove flue with a length of wire she found in the wood box. She had also noticed that Perry Monroe did not speak in class. He was not unintelligent. His written answers were precise and sometimes startlingly perceptive. But he sat through recitations in silence, and when she called on him, he looked at her with an expression that was not defiance and not fear but something in between, something more complicated. And after the second time, she stopped calling on him aloud and instead began leaving questions on a slip of paper on his desk and finding his written answers tucked under the corner of her lesson book. It was a secret communication between them, and she understood without being told that it was important to keep it secret. Some children needed a private door before they could find the public one. On Thursday of the second week, Clarence Monroe appeared at the schoolhouse door at end of day, hat in hand, and said he had come to speak with her about Perry if she had a moment. The other children had scattered. She stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse in the last of the afternoon light, and he stood 2 steps below her on the school steps, which put them at approximately equal height, and she thought that was either accidental or considerate. "He has not spoken to you," Clarence said. It was not an accusation. He looked tired in the way of a man who does not allow himself to be tired and so has stopped noticing it. "Not aloud," Florence said, "but we are communicating." "He is bright, Mr. Monroe, exceptionally so." Something moved through Clarence's face. "He used to talk constantly," he said. "Before." Florence did not ask about the before. She said, "Give me time." He looked at her for a moment. "You are not afraid of it," he said. "Of the silence, most people it makes them nervous." "Silence is just another language," she said. "You learn to listen differently." He put his hat back on. He looked at her for one moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he looked away. "Thank you," he said, "for the effort you are putting into him." "I am putting effort into all of them," she said. "I know," he said. "But I notice you are putting a particular kind into Perry." He walked back to his horse, which was tied at the end of the school fence, and she watched him go and told herself firmly that she was noticing his walk only in the clinical sense of a woman cataloging useful information about the local population. She lied to herself fairly convincingly for approximately another 2 weeks. The Monroe's situation became clearer to her in pieces, the way most things became clear in small towns, through Bertha Henderson's continuous and generous narration, through the careful observations she made herself, and through the occasional fragment that slipped out in conversation. Adeline Monroe had been a San Antonio woman, a banker's daughter, who had come to redemption as a bride with the reasonable expectation that frontier hardship was a temporary condition and not a permanent one. She had found Clarence's silences beautiful at first and then suffocating. She had found the isolation poetic and then maddening. She had loved her children and then found that loving your children inside a life you cannot bear is its own particular dark torment. She had left on a February morning in 1881, taking nothing but her personal trunk, leaving a letter for Clarence and 3 boys who stood at the window, watching the wagon carry their mother toward the stage road. Florence knew what it was to be left by someone. She also knew what it was to leave someone, and she understood that both acts carried their own specific damage. What she had not expected to understand, here in this flatland Texas town, was how both kinds of damage could inhabit the same house, the same set of dark eyes multiplied across a father and 3 boys. The stone started on her 3rd week in redemption. She had accepted Clarence's invitation to supper on a Friday. which Bertha Henderson had advised her was entirely proper since she had extended the invitation to Walter and Edgar's families as well. But the other families had declined politely, and so it was just Florence arriving at the Monroe ranch on the edge of town as the sun went flat and red against the horizon. The ranch house was larger than she expected, solidly built with a covered porch running the full width, a working kitchen garden, and a barn that showed evidence of real maintenance. Clarence Monroe was not a man who let things fall to ruin. Walter had cooked, which surprised and moved her. 14 years old, and he had made a stew that was better than anything she had eaten at the Dusty Bird's Thursday supper service. Edgar talked through the entire meal in his cheerful, relentless way about a horse he intended to train, and a bird he had seen that he believed was unusual. Perry sat at her left hand and ate steadily without speaking, and passed her the cornbread before she thought to ask for it. After supper, Clarence offered to show her the land in the last light, and they walked out past the garden and along the fence line where the creek ran, and he told her how he had built the place up from a single-room structure over 8 years, and she told him about her time at the normal school in Austin, and neither of them said anything very personal, but the conversation had a quality of intimacy that she felt in the back of her throat like the first hint of warmth on a cold day. She had taken the spare room for the night because it was dark by the time supper was finished, and Clarence had said with quiet firmness that he would not send her back to town on an unlit road. The spare room was small and clean with a patchwork quilt that someone had made with care, likely Adeline, though Florence did not ask. She woke in the dark because the floorboards outside her door creaked, very softly in the specific way of a child trying not to make sound. She lay still. She heard a small rustling, barely anything, and then the soft retreating creak of footsteps going back down the hall. In the morning she found the first stone on her pillow. It was oval and smooth, river-worn gray with a single stripe of white quartz through its center. She held it in her hand and thought about it for a long time. She said nothing to Perry about it. She put it in the pocket of her dress and carried it with her all day. She stayed 2 more nights that week because Clarence asked her if she would look over the school records he had kept, enrollment and attendance and lesson plans from the previous teacher who had lasted 4 months before fleeing back to San Antonio. And it was a genuine request, and she had a genuine interest in the records, and also she wanted to stay, and she was only beginning to understand how much that wanting frightened her. The second stone was darker, almost black, flat and smooth on both sides. The third was the one Clarence caught her holding. After he told her about Adeline leaving stones on the windowsill, after the silence between them had stretched to the point where it became its own kind of confession, Florence set the stone down carefully on the edge of the washstand and said, "I need to tell you something, Clarence, about why I left Austin." She had not planned to tell him. She had planned, in the calculated way she planned most things, to take her secrets west with her and let them quietly fossilize. But standing in the lamplight of his spare room, holding his youngest son's kept promise, she found that her plans had changed without consulting her. "You do not owe me that," Clarence said carefully. "No," she said. "But I think I owe you the truth if I am going to be teaching your boys, if I am going to be in this house." He stepped into the room then because they had been having this conversation across a doorway and the doorway was becoming ridiculous. He sat in the single wooden chair by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed. The lamp was between them on the washstand next to the river stone. "I was engaged," she said, "in Austin, to a man named Douglas Hart. He was a lawyer, respectable family. My parents were very pleased." She paused. "He was also engaged to a woman in Galveston at the same time. I discovered this because the woman's father came to Austin looking for him with evidence and found me instead." Clarence was very still. "The hidden motive," she said, "was that Douglas needed money. His family had debts. My father had land. The Galveston woman's father had a shipping concern. Douglas was attempting to solve 2 problems simultaneously." She made her voice very flat and precise because that was the only way to say it. When the Galveston man came, Douglas told everyone that the misunderstanding was my fault, that I had pursued him despite knowing about his prior engagement, that I was unstable. He had witnesses, which is to say, he had friends. Florence, Clarence said. I left, she said, before the story could fully establish itself, which was probably the right decision strategically, though it meant I could not get a reference from anyone in Austin, which is why I ended up answering a 2-year-old advertisement in a county seat most people in Texas have not heard of. Clarence was quiet for a long time. The lamp flame moved in a draft. He lied about you, Clarence said finally, and the simplicity of it, the bare moral clarity, made something collapse a little behind her eyes. Yes, she said. He is the one who should have left, Clarence said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the directness that she had learned in these weeks was his natural mode when he was not being careful, when something had knocked the careful out of him. It was a look that saw her without flinching, and she had not been seen like that in a very long time. Perry leaves you stones, Clarence said, because he left stones for every animal he found on this ranch that was hurt or lost. A small kept promise, he said once. He said it means I am still here. I have not gone anywhere. Florence pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. She breathed through her nose. He does not do it for anyone who visits, Clarence said. He has never done it for anyone but the animals until now. What does that mean? She asked, though she knew she needed to hear him say it. Clarence looked at the stone on the washstand. He looked at his hands. He said, it means he trusts you, and Perry does not trust anyone since his mother left. He stopped. It means he wants you to stay. The silence between them was no longer just a silence. It was a question. Florence picked up the river stone again and turned it in her fingers. She thought about secrets and dark pasts, and the particular trap of caring about people you have not planned to care about. She thought about the way Clarence Monroe had not pressed her for the rest of the story, had not tried to fix it or explain it away, had only said what was true. I cannot promise to stay permanently, she said. I have not promised anyone anything in a long time. I know, he said. I am not asking for a promise. What are you asking? She said. He looked at her then fully with that unguarded face. I am asking if you would consider staying for a while longer, he said, and letting the rest work itself out. She looked at him. She thought she had not planned this, and plans were the only thing standing between her and the kind of hurt she had sworn she would not feel again. And then she thought about Perry placing stones in the dark, one by one, his small hands carrying a language his mother had given him and then abandoned. And she thought about a child who only spoke in secret and about a man who chose his words like he was rationing them for a long winter. All right, Florence Prescott said, for a while longer. The winter of 1883 came in hard across Callahan County, a blue norther sweeping down from the panhandle in November and locking the ground iron solid by Thanksgiving. Florence moved into the Monroe Ranch house in December, not as a romantic arrangement but as a practical one, which was what she told herself and what she also told Bertha Henderson, who smiled with the particular smile of a woman who knows the difference between practical arrangements and love stories, but has the grace not to press the point. The practical fact was that the road between Redemption and the ranch had become treacherous in ice and snow, and the schoolhouse was only 4 days a week in winter due to heating fuel costs, and Clarence had a spare room and 3 boys who were learning badly without consistent supervision of their evening studies. These were all true things. They were also the convenient architecture within which something else was building, stone by stone, in the lamplight of that house. Living in close quarters with Clarence Monroe was an education in a man who had sealed off large parts of himself and did not entirely realize he had done so. He was up before dawn every morning. She could hear him in the kitchen starting the fire, and she began waking early herself, not because she intended to, but because some part of her had calibrated to the sound of him moving through the house. She would come down and he would have coffee ready without comment, and they would sit at the kitchen table in the dark before the boys were up, and in those early mornings she learned more about him than in any deliberate conversation. He talked about the land. Not about himself, not directly, but through the land. The way the creek ran different in drought years. The particular way the sky looked before a bad storm versus a good snow. The seasons of grass and what they meant for the cattle. He had the knowledge of a man who has paid close attention to the world outside himself, because the world inside was too complicated. She talked about books. She had brought 12 with her, crammed into the corners of her carpet bags, and she read in the evenings by the lamp in the front room while he worked on the accounts or mended harness, and the boys did their lessons. She read passages aloud sometimes, and Walter would groan and Edgar would ask questions and Perry would look up from his arithmetic and listen with those dark eyes that missed nothing. "You love books the way I love this land," Clarence said one evening. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without particular drama, as though he was only noting something he had observed. "What does that mean?" she said. "Like it is alive," he said. "Like it matters." She looked at him over the top of her book, and he was looking at her, and neither of them said anything else. And the lamp burned between them and outside the wind, made a long sound around the corners of the house. On the day before Christmas, Florence found Perry in the barn, sitting in the straw beside one of the ranch dogs who had come in hurt from something in the north pasture, a gash on her flank that had been cleaned and dressed by Clarence, but was still causing the animal distress. Perry was not doing anything. He was just sitting beside the dog, one hand resting very gently on the animal's side, steady and present. Florence sat down in the straw on the other side of the dog. Perry looked at her, she looked back, the dog breathed between them. "Your father told me," Florence said quietly, "that you put stones for hurt animals, a small kept promise." Perry looked at the dog, he did not answer. "I think," Florence said, "that is one of the kindest things I have ever heard of." A long pause, the dog shifted, Perry's hand stayed steady. "Mama taught me," Perry said. His voice was rusty from disuse, a thin, careful sound. Florence kept her face very calm. "She sounds like she was kind." "She was scared," Perry said, with the devastating clarity of an 8-year-old who has processed something over 2 years of quiet. "She got scared of here, of staying." Florence looked at the dog. "Staying is hard sometimes," she said. "Leaving is also hard. People do things for complicated reasons." "Are you scared?" Perry asked. Florence thought about that. She thought about Douglas Hart and the story he had told about her and the road out of Austin and the advertisement in the newspaper. She thought about the stone she still carried in her dress pocket every day, the third one, the one she had been holding when Clarence told her the truth. "Yes," she said. "A little." Perry considered this. "But you are still here," he said. "I am still here," she said. He reached into the pocket of his dungarees and produced a smooth gray stone, barely bigger than a thumbnail, and placed it very carefully on the straw beside Florence's knee. He looked up at her. His eyes were his father's eyes exactly, dark and careful and searching. She picked it up. She held it in her palm. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with every part of herself. Perry looked at the dog again. After a moment he said, "She is going to be all right, Papa says." "She is," Florence agreed. "She has someone keeping her company." Something around Perry's mouth relaxed. A fraction of an opening. The first hint of a smile that had been absent so long it had to move carefully back into place. Florence stayed in the barn until the dog was settled, and then she went back inside and found Clarence in the kitchen making something for Christmas tomorrow. Biscuits from a recipe that had been his grandmother's. And she stood in the doorway for a moment watching his hands work the dough, and felt something in her that was not fear, and was not longing, and was not the careful withholding she had practiced for 3 years, but was something that did not have a name yet because it was still new. Christmas Day came with a brightness that followed the storm, the scrubland around the ranch white and glittering and enormous under a sky so blue it seemed invented. Edgar had found a scrawny juniper and installed it in the front room with a kind of triumphant ceremony. Walter had made candles. Perry had left 4 stones in a row on the kitchen windowsill, one for each person in the house. Florence had brought gifts from town before the snow. A book on horse training for Walter that made him go very still and careful with gratitude. A brass compass for Edgar whose reaction was considerably louder. And for Perry a small journal with a proper leather cover and a pencil with a good point. Perry opened it and looked at her and she said, "For your own private words," and he clutched it against his chest and nodded once, very seriously. Clarence gave her a pair of proper riding gloves, soft leather with good stitching, which was an intensely practical gift, and also, given that she did not ride particularly well yet, an implicit offer to teach her, and she understood both things and said thank you and meant both thank you simultaneously. He had also put a single river stone on top of the gloves inside the paper wrapping, small and smooth and white. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I did not want to be left out," he said, and there it was, a real smile, unguarded, and it rearranged his whole face into something that was younger and warmer and so unexpectedly beautiful that she had to look away before he could read what was in her expression. January brought a different kind of trouble. A man arrived in Redemption by the name of Silas Prentice, who described himself as a land speculator from Fort Worth, and who began asking questions about the properties east of the creek, including the Monroe Ranch. Clarence came in from town one afternoon with a particular look on his face that Florence had not seen before, a tightness around the eyes that went beyond tired. "He has a letter of introduction from a judge in Abilene," Clarence said that evening after the boys were in bed. They were at the kitchen table with a single lamp and the accounts spread between them, which was a thing that had happened gradually, Florence helping with the accounts because she was better at numbers than Clarence would admit, and he was too sensible to refuse help on principle. "Is the letter legitimate?" Florence asked. "Maybe," Clarence said. "The judge is real enough. But the introduction says Prentice represents investors interested in land for railroad right-of-way." He ran his hand over his face. "There have been rumors about a spur line coming through this county for 2 years. If they decide to route it east of town rather than west, the Monroe Ranch sits directly in the right-of-way." Florence set down her pen. "Can they take it?" "They can try to force a sale," Clarence said. "They have done it before in other counties. They find a technical fault in the land title, or they pressure the county judge, or they simply make the offer so many times that the economic pressure becomes intolerable." He looked at the lamp. "I have 3 boys, a working ranch. I cannot afford a legal fight with a railroad company, and I cannot afford to walk away from this land." "Tell me about the title," Florence said. He looked at her. "The original deed was recorded in 1872. I bought the land from a man named Garrett who had homesteaded it. Garrett is dead. His wife went to her sister's family in Waco. The deed was recorded properly. I checked it then and I have checked it since." "But you need a lawyer," Florence said. "I cannot afford a lawyer, not a good one," Florence thought. She thought about Austin and the legal circles she had moved in as Douglas Hart's fiancé, the men she had known, the names she had heard. She thought about the fact that she had left Austin with the story attached to her name that Douglas had constructed, which meant she could not easily go back. She also thought about whether she was willing to try. "I know a man," she said carefully. "He was a colleague of Douglas Hart's, but he was not a friend of his. His name is Samuel Beckett, and he is an honest lawyer, which is not as common as one might prefer. He has a particular interest in land title cases." Clarence watched her. "You would have to write to Austin," he said. "Yes. And that might reopen the story," he said, meaning Douglas's story, the one that had chased her out of Austin. "It might," Florence said. "I will not ask you to do that," Clarence said. "You are not asking," Florence said. "I am offering. There is a difference." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she was learning to read, the particular look he had when something had gotten through the careful outer layer and he was not sure what to do about it. "Florence," he said. Her name in his voice was a whole sentence on its own. "Let me write the letter," she said, "and let us see what happens." She wrote to Samuel Beckett, and she also wrote a second letter, which she did not tell Clarence about, to a woman in Austin named Clara Wells, who had been the only one who had believed her version of events over Douglas Hart's. Clara was a sharp-tongued, fearless woman who knew everyone in Austin's legal and social community, and who had been quietly furious on Florence's behalf for 3 years. Florence asked Clara to find out what Silas Prentice's history was, who he worked for, and whether there were any other properties he had targeted under similar circumstances. The letters went out on the next stage east. The waiting was its own kind of darkness. In the meantime, Prentice began appearing in town more frequently. He was a smooth man, well-dressed by frontier standards, with the pleasant face of someone accustomed to being underestimated. Florence saw him twice on the main street, once at the general store and once leaving the Dusty Bird, and both times he looked at her with a flicker of recognition that puzzled her, until she realized he had likely asked around about the Monroe household and knew she was living there as the schoolteacher. On the third occasion, he stopped her on the boardwalk. "Miss Prescott," he said with a pleasant smile, "I wonder if you might be able to help me. I understand you are well acquainted with Clarence Monroe." "I teach his children," she said. "Of course," Prentice said. "A fine family. I have been trying to arrange a meeting with Mr. Monroe regarding a business proposition that I believe he would find financially very beneficial. I wonder if you might encourage him to take the meeting." Florence looked at him steadily. The trap of this was very clear. He wanted her influence, which meant he believed she had influence, which was either good information or bad depending on what he intended to do with it. "Mr. Monroe is a capable man who makes his own decisions," she said pleasantly. "I am sure if you approach him directly he will hear you out." Prentice's smile stayed exactly in place. "Of course," he said, "only sometimes a trusted voice can smooth the path." "I am not a path smoother," Florence said. "Good day, Mr. Prentice." She told Clarence that evening and watched the muscles in his jaw work. "He is using you as a lever," Clarence said. "He is trying to," Florence said. "It will not work." "He does not know you," Clarence said, with a quiet certainty that landed somewhere warm in her chest. "No," she agreed. "He does not." The letter from Samuel Beckett arrived in February, 3 weeks after she had written to him. Beckett was cautious but interested. He had heard of Prentice. The man worked for an investment group in Fort Worth that had in fact participated in 2 previous land acquisition schemes that had ended badly for the original landowners, one in Parker County and one in Hood County. There were allegations of document forgery in the Hood County case, but nothing had been proven. Beckett said he was willing to make the journey to redemption if Monroe could afford his travel expenses and a reduced fee. Having been reminded by Miss Prescott of certain principles he had gone into law to uphold. Florence had not told Beckett what to think. She had simply told him the facts of the case and invoked, briefly and precisely, the principles he had spoken about once at a dinner party in Austin when Douglas Hart had been talking about the value of expediency. Beckett had disagreed with Douglas that evening. Florence had noticed. She handed Clarence the letter and watched him read it. "You told him about principles," Clarence said when he finished. "I told him the truth," she said. "Beckett is the kind of man who responds to that." Clarence set the letter down on the kitchen table. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You are extraordinary, you know." The directness of it struck her without warning and she felt color rise in her face, which she had not done since she was 19 and had thought feeling things was safe. "I made 2 inquiries," she said. "Florence," he said, and again her name was its own complete language. "Will you stop deflecting for one moment?" She stopped. She looked at him. "I have been careful for 2 years," he said, "not wanting to ask anything of anyone, not wanting the boys to see me needing anything. And then you came, and you are the most quietly formidable person I have ever met, and I do not know what to do about that." "What do you want to do about it?" she said. "Something I have not done in long enough that I am not certain I still know how," he said. She held very still. "I would like to court you," Clarence Monroe said, "properly, if you are willing." Florence thought about secrets and dark pasts and forbidden softness and the stone she still carried in her pocket. She thought about the practical wisdom of maintaining distance and the complete irrelevance of practical wisdom in this particular moment. "I am willing," she said. The word of Clarence Monroe courting the schoolteacher went through Redemption with the speed and enthusiasm of a thing the town had been waiting for. Bertha Henderson told Florence she had been waiting for this since the first week. Walter Monroe, 14 and attempting to be inscrutable about it, began making sure supper was especially good on the nights Florence stayed. Edgar Monroe talked about it directly and at length to Florence's face, which was exactly in character. Perry Monroe left an extra stone. Samuel Beckett arrived in mid-February, a lean, tidy man in his 40s with reading glasses and the precise manner of someone who has spent decades making arguments to skeptical audiences. He spent 3 days reviewing the title documentation for the Monroe Ranch and spent an additional day making quiet inquiries in town about Prentice's movements and methods. What Beckett found, with the help of Clara Wells's letter which had arrived the previous week, was that Prentice had a hidden partner in the county commissioner's office, a man named Aldous Webb who had quietly been introducing legislation that would allow land to be condemned for railroad right-of-way at prices significantly below market value. The trap had been set before Prentice ever arrived in Redemption. It required only the right pressure applied at the right moment. Beckett went to see the county judge in Abilene, not with accusations but with documentation, the kind of careful, organized legal documentation that was difficult to explain away. He also sent copies to a newspaper editor in Dallas who had a known interest in railroad corruption stories. The combination produced results more quickly than Florence had expected. Aldous Webb resigned from the commissioner's office in March citing poor health. Silas Prentice left Redemption on a Thursday morning without speaking to anyone. The Monroe Ranch title was reviewed, confirmed as unimpeachable, and recorded with additional notations that would make future challenges significantly more difficult. Clarence paid Beckett what he could, which was not much. Beckett told him not to worry about it, that he had found the work valuable in several ways, and looked at Florence when he said it in a way that she understood to mean that he found the work valuable primarily because it had given him a reason to come here and see for himself that she was all right. He shook Clarence's hand and told him with a directness that surprised Clarence that he was a lucky man, and he hoped he knew it. "I know it," Clarence said. He said it without looking at Beckett and without looking at Florence. He said it to the middle distance. In the quiet, certain way he said the things he meant most deeply. Florence was standing 3 feet away, and she heard it, and she did not say anything, and neither did he, but something settled between them like a stone finding its place in still water. Spring came back to Callahan County, the way it always came to that part of Texas. Suddenly, and with extravagance, the mesquite greening overnight and the wildflowers appearing in the scrubland in waves of color that seemed implausible against the gray winter memory. Florence began teaching Perry to ride, not because she rode particularly well herself, but because she and Perry had made a secret agreement one afternoon in the barn that they would both learn better together. And this was one of the private understandings that had accumulated between them over the winter. Clarence watched them from the fence one afternoon, Perry on the patient old mare they called Tuesday and Florence walking alongside, one hand on the bridle, talking to Perry in the steady, quiet way she talked to him that was different from how she talked to anyone else. Perry was talking back. Not in the rusty, careful way of those first months, but in the fuller voice of a child who has been slowly, steadily reminded that his voice is worth using. "He speaks now," Walter said from beside Clarence. 14 and noticing things the way 14 can see the things adults think they are hiding. "He does," Clarence said. "It is because of Miss Prescott," Walter said. "Among other things," Clarence said carefully. Walter looked at his father with the level look of an eldest son who has been carrying adult perception in a child's frame for 2 years. "Papa," he said, "you can just say it." Clarence looked at his oldest son. He was quiet for a moment. "I love her," he said, simply. The first time he had said it aloud, even to himself. Walter nodded. "I know," he said. "We all know. Edgar made a bet with himself about when you would figure it out. Edgar won." Clarence looked back at the corral where Florence was laughing at something Perry had said, her dark hair loose from its pins in the spring wind, and the laugh was open and real and unguarded in a way that he had spent months slowly, carefully learning to bring out of her. He asked her that evening. The boys had gone to bed. They were on the covered porch in the first real warmth of the year, 2 chairs, the dark land enormous around the house, the stars coming up over the eastern edge of the world with the patient extravagance of stars that have no competition from other lights. "Florence," he said. She looked at him. "I want to marry you," he said. "Not because of the practical arrangement, not because the boys need someone. Because I am in love with you, and I have been for longer than I admitted to myself, and I would very much like you to be my wife." Florence looked at him for a long time. She turned the small river stone in her fingers, the 3rd stone, which she had carried every day for 4 months. She thought about all the reasons to say no, the careful distances she had maintained, the dark past, the forbidden softness, the ultimate sacrifice of not feeling too much. She catalogued every one of them and then she set them aside. "I love you," she said, with the same simplicity he had used, the cleanest language available. "Yes, I will marry you." He reached across the space between the 2 chairs and covered her hand with his, the hand that held the stone, and they sat like that for a while in the spring dark while the stars came all the way up and the land breathed around them. They were married in June of 1883 at the Redemption Church, which was a small white building that smelled of pine resin and the accumulated faith of 400 people who needed something to hold on to in hard country. Bertha Henderson cried with the uninhibited joy of someone who has been proven right about something important. Samuel Beckett sent a letter of congratulation and a proper law book as a wedding gift. Clara Wells sent a bolt of blue fabric that was more beautiful than anything available in Callahan County. Walter stood up properly beside his father as best man, too young for the role and completely equal to it. Edgar was technically the ring bearer and managed this with only one dropped moment that he recovered from smoothly. Perry stood at Florence's left side during the ceremony, as he had asked to, and Florence had said yes without hesitation, because she understood that Perry needed to be adjacent to this moment, needed to be included in the architecture of the new thing being built. The minister spoke about covenant, and about the dry land made fruitful, and about small acts of faithfulness repeated over time making something larger than any single act. Florence listened to the words and thought about river stones. At the end of the ceremony, before they turned to face the congregation, Perry reached up and tucked something into Florence's hand. She looked down. It was a stone she had not seen before, larger than the others, smooth and warm and dark, shot through with 3 separate veins of white quartz like rivers running through it. She closed her hand around it. She looked at Perry and he looked at her with those serious dark eyes, and then he smiled. The full real smile that had been slowly coming back over the winter and spring. And it was Clarence's smile exactly. And it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The summer of 1883 was good to the Monroe Ranch in the way that good summers reward the work of bad years. The cattle were healthy. The garden was abundant. Florence taught through the summer months, a thing unheard of in most frontier towns but not in Redemption, where she had persuaded the school board that children's learning did not benefit from a full summer cessation. And the board had agreed with the enthusiasm of people who had recently discovered they had a teacher who actually knew what she was doing and intended to keep her occupied enough to stay. She and Clarence fell into the life of it with the ease of people who have already been through the difficult part, the revealing, the choosing, the building of trust in the particular dark before dawn of a Texas winter. The marriage felt like a natural consequence of what had already been between them rather than a beginning of something new. The new things were smaller and better than she had expected. She discovered that Clarence sang. Not publicly, not in any way he acknowledged, but in the barn in the mornings when he thought no one could hear. He sang hymns in a genuine and unself-conscious baritone that she would come to consider one of the great secret pleasures of her life. She told him once that she had heard him, and he went very still and then looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read and then said, "Well, I suppose there is no help for it," and thereafter sang without trying to hide it, which improved everyone's mornings considerably. She discovered that Perry's journal had become something important to him. He showed her entries sometimes, passing the journal across the breakfast table without comment, and she would read and pass it back without comment, because that was their language, the quiet passing of significant things in the space between words. She learned to ride properly that summer, really ride, and Clarence taught her with the patience of a man who finds satisfaction in teaching someone he loves something he loves. And there were afternoons of long riding across the flat land between the creek and the hills to the north, where the sky was so enormous that it felt like a different relationship with time, slower and larger than the small human concerns below it. Edgar, 11 and endlessly curious, attached himself to Florence as a kind of secondary research project, asking her questions about everything she had ever read, every place she had ever been, every person she had ever known, with the systematic thoroughness of a born naturalist. She answered everything she could and said, "I do not know for the rest," which Edgar apparently found satisfying as a response because it meant there were still things to be found out. Walter was growing in the way of 14 going on 15, filling out through the shoulders, developing the careful, measured manner that was Clarence in miniature. He was protective of Florence in a way that was different from his protection of his younger brothers, more deliberate, as though he had decided something and was enacting it. She did not press him on it, but she did tell him once quietly when they happened to be alone in the kitchen that she was grateful for his acceptance of her. Walter had looked at her for a moment and then said, "You stayed," as though that was the whole of the matter. "I stayed," she agreed. "That matters," he said. "It matters a great deal." She understood what he was not saying. She understood it in the bone-deep way of someone who has also been left, who knows the shape of that absence, who knows that presence, simple continued presence, is not a small thing. In October, Florence realized she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days, turning it over with the same careful attention she gave to all significant information, making sure she knew what she felt about it before she said anything. What she felt was, astonishingly, not fear, or not primarily fear. Primarily, she felt something that was related to the warmth of river stones in the palm of her hand, something about continuity and kept promises. She told Clarence on a Sunday morning before the boys were up, in the early morning lamp quiet that was still the time of most significant conversation in their house. He was very still for a moment. Then his face did something she had only seen it do in parts before but had never seen it do entirely. It opened, the whole careful architecture of protection and restraint undone in a single moment, and he was only joy. It was the most completely she had ever seen him. He came around the table to her and held her face in both his hands and looked at her with that open, demolished face and said, "Florence." "I know," she said. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. And then he put his forehead against hers, and they stood like that for a while in the quiet kitchen while the lamp burned, and the house began to wake around them. Perry took the news with characteristic solemnity. He did not say much. He went to the creek that afternoon and came back with a stone he put on the kitchen windowsill. Edgar talked about the biological process of fetal development for 20 minutes and was eventually redirected. Walter nodded once with the gravity of a boy assuming another layer of responsibility, and then, when he thought no one was looking, smiled so widely it looked like it might split his face. The baby came in June of 1884. A boy, born on a morning that was warm and blue and still, delivered by the redemption midwife, who had seen difficult births and easy ones and knew within the first hour that this was going to be one of the easy ones. Florence labored through the night and the morning, and then, as the sun came up properly over the eastern land, a boy came into the world with strong lungs and dark hair, and a look of intense personal outrage at the circumstances of his arrival that made the midwife laugh. Clarence was in the room, which was not standard practice but which Florence had required, and he held her hand through the labor with a steadiness that she would think about afterward as one of the definitive things she knew about him. He did not leave. He did not diminish. He stayed and was steady, and when the baby came, he held it with the ease of a man who has held babies before, and the reverence of a man for whom this particular baby represents something new. They named him James, for Florence's father, who had not handled the Douglas Hart situation well, but who had loved her before and after it in the imperfect way of fathers who do not know how to say complicated things. Perry came in to see the baby first before Edgar, before Walter, because Florence asked for him specifically. He stood beside the bed and looked at James with enormous seriousness and then looked at Florence. "He is very small," Perry said. "He will grow," Florence said. Perry reached into his pocket and placed a stone on the pillow beside James's head, very carefully, the way he placed all his stones, with intention and gentleness. He looked up at Florence. "A kept promise," Perry said. Florence felt the tears come before she could prevent them, which was all right. She had spent 3 years making sure not to cry, and now she was home and it was allowed. "Yes," she said, "a kept promise." The years after James's birth settled into the particular richness of a life that is working, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but with the fundamental rightness of people who have chosen each other and their lives with clear eyes, and kept choosing through all the small and large tests that frontier life provides. There were hard seasons. A drought in 1885 that drove the creek down to a trickle and cost them 2/3 of the cattle herd, and required a winter of careful, bone-spare economy that Florence managed with the same unsentimental efficiency she brought to everything. There was a year when Edgar, 13 and testing the limits of good judgment, got himself into serious trouble with a broken window, a stolen watermelon, and a sequence of escalating misjudgments that ended with Clarence having a long, private conversation with his second son that Florence wisely did not interfere with. There was the summer Walter, 16, rode out with an older man to work a cattle drive to Dodge City over Clarence's objections, and the 2 months of Clarence's tight-jawed, controlled worry while they waited for word, and the afternoon Walter rode back broader through the shoulders and quieter in the way of a boy who has become a young man somewhere out on the trail. Through all of it, the house remained what it had become, a place of accumulation, of books and stones and the ongoing conversation of people who had chosen to be in the same life. Florence's 12 books had become 43. The windowsill stones Perry had started as a child had spread to include additional collections on the porch railing and the barn shelf, and a particular flat rock by the creek that had become, by unspoken agreement, a kind of memorial to the ones they had all loved and lost, Adeline in her way, Florence's mother who died in 1884, the ranch dog who had recovered from her wound and lived another 4 years. Perry turned 12, 13, 14. His voice finished deepening and settled into something that still had Clarence's quality to it, the careful, chosen use of words. He was gifted in ways that Florence had seen from the beginning, a particular mathematical precision combined with an unusual capacity for understanding the interior states of people and animals. He wrote in his journal every day. He showed Florence entries sometimes still, and she still read without comment and passed it back. He did not stop leaving stones. This was the thing Florence thought about sometimes in the evenings, when the house was quiet and Clarence was reading beside her and James, a toddler than a small boy, was asleep, and the older boys were at their own occupations. Perry, at 14, still left a stone on her pillow on the nights she had been away in town for the school board meeting or the occasional women's society gathering. It was no longer a secret communication from a grieving child. It had become something else, a ritual that had persisted past its original purpose and become simply itself, a quiet declaration of something that did not need words because it had been a wordless language from the beginning. I am still here. You are still here. We are still here. James at 2 was a loud, physical, intensely cheerful contradiction of nearly everything Perry had been as a small child, which Florence found funny in a private way, the universe's determination to provide variety. James at 3 began his own collection of river stones, gathered from the creek with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of a toddler for whom shininess and wetness were the primary criteria. He brought them to Florence in handfuls, pressed them into her palm with urgent generosity, and she received every one with the same gravity she had given Perry's first offering. Clarence watched this one afternoon, and she caught him watching, and he had that look again, the open, unprotected one that still had the capacity to undo her, the face he kept for moments he trusted completely. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "only that I am happy." "Good," she said. And then, because she was Florence and she had been precise with language her whole life, "I am also happy," in case that was not evident. "It is very evident," he said, with the ghost of the smile. "You laughed at breakfast." "I laugh at breakfast," she said. "You laugh at breakfast now," he said. "You did not always." She thought about the first months, the careful distances she had maintained, the way she had held herself away from softness like a woman holding a burn away from fire. She thought about what it had cost her to stop doing that, and what she had been given in exchange. And the math was so obviously in her favor that she felt something like fond gratitude toward her own younger self for finally, eventually, being brave enough to put the walls down. In 1886, Walter, 17, announced his intention to stay on the ranch, not as his father's son managing a dependency, but as a partner in the enterprise, which was the word he used, and which he backed up with a presentation about cattle breeding that he had apparently been developing for 6 months that was thorough enough to make Clarence sit back in his chair and look at his eldest son with a new kind of respect. They spent 3 evenings that week working through the details together, Florence occasionally contributing the accounting perspective. And by the end of it, there was an informal partnership that would, over the following years, transform the Monroe Ranch from a survival operation into something genuinely prosperous. Edgar, 15 and constitutionally incapable of settling, told Florence confidentially that he intended to study natural science, that there was a school in San Antonio, and eventually, he thought there might be a possibility of a university in one of the eastern cities. Florence had been helping him prepare for this for 2 years, having recognized the direction he was heading long before Edgar had articulated it himself. She wrote letters on his behalf to people she knew in academic circles. Edgar would leave at 17 and study his way into a career that took him eventually to Austin, and then to the East, and then back again, always returning with stories that put Edgar-sized amounts of noise and enthusiasm back into the house for the duration of his visits. Perry stayed. This was not a surprise to anyone who knew him. Perry had put his roots into the land the way the mesquite had, deep and quiet and not easily moved. He worked the ranch alongside Walter, and learned from Clarence the same language of land and seasons, and patience that Clarence had learned from the country itself. He also, in the fullness of time, began teaching the younger children of Redemption to read, not as an official schoolteacher, Florence was that, but as a kind of voluntary extension of the school, working with the children who were struggling, using the wordless patience he had learned in his own silence as a tool for reaching the ones who had been told they could not learn. Florence watched this with the particular pride of someone who has been part of making a thing happen without being able to claim it, because the thing had always been in Perry. She had only helped it find the door. In 1887, Florence realized she was expecting again. The second child, born in early 1888, was a girl, and they named her Ruth, and Perry left the largest stone he had ever placed on Florence's windowsill on the night Ruth came home from the midwife's care. It was a stone the size of a hand, flat and gray and warm from being kept in his pocket, and it had more lines of white quartz through it than she had ever seen in a single stone, running in all directions like a map of everything that connected everything else. James, 4 years old and deeply interested in everything his older half-brothers did, had by this point fully absorbed the meaning of the stones, in the way that children absorb the meanings of household rituals without being taught them explicitly. He began adding his own offerings to the household's collection, supplementing the river stones with creek shells and interesting sticks, and once a quite magnificent feather that Florence put in the blue ceramic jar she kept on the kitchen shelf, and which was still there years later, faded but not gone. Ruth grew up to be a Florence in miniature, dark-haired and precise, and with opinions about everything that she articulated early and often. She and Perry had a relationship from the beginning that was its own specific thing, a quiet understanding between two quiet people, though Perry was quiet by nature and Ruth was quiet by strategy, choosing when to speak with the deliberateness of someone who knows words are tools and should be used correctly. The schoolhouse in Redemption was replaced with a larger one in 1888, due in significant part to Florence's lobbying of the school board, the county education authority, and everyone she had ever corresponded with who had any influence in Texas educational policy. The new schoolhouse had 2 rooms and a stove that did not smoke from any direction, and enough slate board for all 38 students who were now enrolled. Redemption having grown as the railroad that had once threatened, the Monroe Ranch had instead been routed through the south end of town and brought commerce and population in its wake. Florence taught in the new schoolhouse with the same precision and quiet intensity she had brought to the original one. She had by 1889 developed a reputation in Callahan County and the surrounding counties as a teacher of genuine quality, and the county education board consulted her on curriculum matters with the increasing frequency of people who have discovered that a particular person is almost always right about their subject. She and Clarence in the evenings of those years continued their early morning kitchen table conversation, though it had expanded now to the full length of the day, and then condensed back to the morning kitchen table where it had always lived. They talked about the ranch and the school and the boys and Ruth and the land and the books and the things they had read and thought and observed. They disagreed sometimes, clearly and without drama, and resolved the disagreements the same way. She had never had a conversation with another person that had this quality, the sense of thinking together rather than separately, and she recognized it as the most intimate thing she had ever experienced. He still sang in the barn in the mornings. She still carried a river stone in her pocket every day, rotating them from the collection on the windowsill, choosing the day's stone with the private pleasure of someone engaging in a ritual that is only comprehensible from the inside. Perry, now 20 in 1895, had added his own chapter to the ranch story by breeding a particular line of horses that began attracting buyers from as far as Fort Worth, working with Walter's cattle operation as complementary enterprises that made the Monroe Ranch, by the middle of the decade, one of the most stable and respected operations in Callahan County. He was a man by then, fully himself, quiet and perceptive and good, and Florence looked at him sometimes and thought about an 8-year-old placing stones in the dark and felt the weight of what time does when it is given good materials to work with. Perry fell in love in 1896 with a young woman named Harriet Cole, a rancher's daughter from the next county over, who had the interesting quality of being almost as quiet as Perry and significantly more stubborn, which Florence privately felt was an excellent combination. Harriet came to the Monroe Ranch for Sunday dinner and sat beside Perry and looked at the stone collection on the windowsill with calm curiosity, without asking about it until she knew enough to ask the right question, which was something Florence respected deeply. Perry explained the stones to Harriet in the kitchen one afternoon while Florence was at the stove, and he did not know Florence was listening because she was being very quiet, and she heard him tell Harriet about his mother's stones on the windowsill, and about the stones he had left for Florence in the first winter, and about what they meant, the kept promise, the "I am still here." Harriet listened and then said, "What made you decide to leave one for her?" Perry was quiet for a moment. "She was not scared of my silence," he said. "Most people fill silence because they are uncomfortable with it. She sat in the barn with me and the hurt dog, and she did not try to fill it. She just stayed." A pause. "I thought she was worth a stone." Florence kept her back very carefully to the kitchen and stirred what she was stirring and blinked several times with determination. Perry married Harriet in the fall of 1897 at the same Redemption Church where Clarence and Florence had married 14 years before. The Monroe household continued its expansion. James was 13 by this time, the loud physical cheerfulness having developed into a genuine athletic grace and an unexpected capacity for mathematics that Florence had been quietly fostering for 2 years. Ruth was 9, already demonstrating the organizational ferocity that would eventually make her the most efficiently run household in Callahan County. Walter, 30 now, had married in 1893, a steady, capable woman named June who had grown up on a neighboring ranch and understood the work without needing it explained. And their contribution to the family's expansion had by 1897 included 2 children of their own, a boy and then a girl, who were at large in the Monroe household with the cheerful, destructive enthusiasm of grandchildren everywhere. Clarence at 46 was more himself than he had been at 32. This was Florence's settled view on the matter. The years had done good work on him the way the weather does good work on good timber, revealing rather than destroying. The gray at his temples had spread to a substantial portion of his hair, which he wore slightly longer than was strictly fashionable because Florence had told him once she found it distinguished, and he had looked startled and pleased and not cut it shorter since. He moved through the ranch with an ease that was no longer about proving something. It was simply a man in the place he belonged. They still had their morning conversations, earlier now than ever because the ranch operations were large enough that dawn came busy, and the kitchen table in the early dark was still their best hour. Florence had stopped teaching the full school schedule by 1896, sharing the duties with a younger teacher she had trained herself, keeping the advanced students and the curriculum planning and the county board responsibilities, but giving her mornings back to the house and the ranch and the life that had become the most important work she had ever done. She still put stones in her pocket every morning. In the fall of 1898, Perry came to find Florence in the vegetable garden, which she still kept with the same attention she had given it since the first year of the marriage, and he stood at the garden gate with an expression that she recognized as significant because Perry's expressions were always significant. He waited for her to come to him, which she did. "Harriet is expecting," he said. Florence set down her trowel. She looked at her stepson, who was 23 years old and a man entirely, and she found the same quality of joy in herself that she had felt when Clarence had told her about James, and then again about Ruth. The extending of the house outward, the kept promises multiplying. "When?" she said. "Spring," he said. She crossed the small distance between them and put her arms around him, something she had not done often because Perry, like his father, was not a person who initiated touch, and you learned to wait for the right moment. He held on with the particular grip of someone who has been waiting for the right moment too. "She will be well," Florence said, "and you will be wonderful at this." "You do not know that," Perry said against her hair. "I do know that," she said. "I have known you for 16 years. Perry's first child was born in April of 1899, a boy, strong and dark-haired, and loud in the manner of babies who are not concerned about taking up space. They named him Thomas. Thomas Monroe came into the world, and Perry came to find Florence in the kitchen at the Monroe Ranch house the day after Thomas's birth, and he set a river stone on the kitchen table in front of her without saying anything, and looked at her with his father's eyes, dark and certain, and full of the things that did not need words, because They had always had another language. Florence picked up the stone and held it in her palm and looked at Perry, and she understood that this was the full circle of it, the language returning to where it had started, the kept promise completing itself and starting again. "He is beautiful," Florence said. "He is," Perry said. "Welcome, grandfather," Florence said to Clarence, who had come in from the barn and was standing in the kitchen doorway. And Clarence looked at Perry and at Florence and at the stone in her hand and laughed, which was not something Clarence Monroe did readily, but when he did it was the best sound in any room. The year 1899 turned to 1900, and with it the century, which the citizens of Redemption marked with a gathering at the church and a bonfire on the main street, and a great deal of the kind of optimism that endings and beginnings create in people, regardless of whether they have earned it. Florence stood with Clarence on the porch of the ranch house after they had returned from town, Ruth on her other side, James somewhere in the dark beyond the firelight, and the night was cold and clear, and the stars were doing what stars do over the Texas scrubland. "A new century," Ruth said, with the contemplative tone of a 10-year-old who takes centuries seriously. "So it appears," Clarence said. "What do you think will happen?" Ruth said. Clarence considered. "Good things and difficult things," he said, "in roughly the proportion they always have." "That is not a very precise answer," Ruth said. "No," Clarence said, "but it is an honest one." Florence had her hand in Clarence's, their fingers interlocked with the ease of 17 years of practice, and she was looking at the stars and thinking about the teacher who had stepped off a stage in this town with 2 carpet bags and a carefully maintained distance from everything soft, and about the man who had been standing on the boardwalk holding his hat in his hand with the whole territory of his loss visible in the careful lines of his face, and about the child who had placed a stone in the dark as a kept promise. She thought about betrayal and secrets and hidden motives and dark pasts and all the forbidding architecture of careful people keeping themselves safe, and she thought about how all of it had turned out to be insufficient defense against a man who said things simply and a boy who spoke in stones. She reached into her coat pocket. The stone was there, smooth and warm, the first one she had picked up in 1900 from the windowsill, gray with the white quartz stripe through its center, the first one Perry had ever left her. She turned it in her fingers in the dark. "Florence," Clarence said quietly. He was not looking at the stars, he was looking at her. "I know," she said. 17 years, he said. 17 years, she agreed. Ruth had moved away to look at the bonfire's dying glow in the direction of town, giving them the moment without knowing she was giving it, the particular grace of a child who has grown up in a house where private moments are respected. Clarence raised her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles in the unhurried way of a man who is in no danger of running out of time. His lips were warm against the cold of the January night. "I would do all of it again," he said against her hand, "every day of it. Even the difficult things," she said. "Especially the difficult things," he said. "They were the ones that mattered most." She turned to look at him. His face in the dark was the face she knew better than any landscape she had ever ridden through, every line and angle of it familiar and still, after 17 years, capable of doing the thing that it had done since the beginning, which was to be the face she wanted to be facing when she thought about what she was and where she was. "I love you," she said, the simplest language. "I love you," he said. In the house behind them, on the kitchen windowsill, a row of river stones caught the last light of a dying fire. On the bedroom pillow upstairs, a small gray stone sat in the lamplight, placed there by a 24-year-old man who had spent 16 years practicing a language his mother had given him and Florence Prescott had taught him to trust. Small kept promises, every last one of them. The creek ran low that January, but it ran clear, and the mesquite was bare but already gathering its green beneath the bark, and the stars over Callahan County were the same stars that had always been there, indifferent and magnificent, and below them A woman with a river stone in her pocket stood on the porch of her home in the arms of her husband and was, thoroughly and permanently and without reservation, exactly where she belonged. The Redemption Schoolhouse kept Florence's name in its records for 40 years. Long after she had handed the teaching work fully to the younger teachers she had trained, the County Education Board continued to refer to her curriculum guides and her student assessment methods, copied and passed hand to hand through the schools of the surrounding counties, in the way of things that work being replicated quietly, without ceremony, simply because they work. Perry kept a stone collection on the windowsill of every house he ever occupied. His son Thomas took up the habit in his own time, and Thomas's daughter after him, and it became one of those family customs whose origin most of the family did not fully know, but which persisted because it felt important in the way that true things feel important even when you cannot entirely articulate why. James Monroe, 21 years old in 1905, left for university in Austin, which Florence had spent 3 years helping him prepare for, and which Clarence was unable to be entirely straightforward about being proud of, because that was still, at 54, the thing Clarence Monroe found most difficult, the open expression of pride in the people he loved most. He managed it adequately. James went and studied mathematics and came back with a teaching certificate of his own, and eventually took a position at the school in a neighboring county, which put him close enough to ride home for Sunday dinner for the rest of his parents' lives. Ruth stayed in Redemption, which surprised no one who knew her. She married a careful, perceptive man who ran the general store, and who had the excellent quality of finding Ruth's organizational ferocity an advantage rather than a problem. And they had 3 children in quick succession, and a household that was the most efficiently managed in Callahan County, in 2 counties' competing estimations. Walter's partnership with the ranch extended to the next generation in the manner of the best partnerships, growing as the people grew, until the Monroe Ranch was something that visitors to Callahan County were pointed toward as an example of what sustained, committed work over time could make of unpromising flat land. Edgar wrote from wherever he was, letters that arrived in dense paragraphs on thin paper describing new species of insects and new academic friendships and new places he had seen. Letters that Florence read aloud at the kitchen table to whoever was present, and that Clarence listened to with the expression of a man who finds the world's variety both bewildering and genuinely wonderful. Clarence, at 60, still sang in the barn in the mornings. Florence still went down early and made coffee, and listened through the kitchen window to the hymns carrying across the cold morning air, and still found it the most quietly perfect thing she knew of. On the morning of her 53rd birthday, which was a clear March morning with the first of the year's warmth in it, and the creek running high from good winter rains, Florence came down to the kitchen and found the table set with the kind of care that required collaboration, which meant all of them had been involved. Clarence and James home from his school for the occasion, and Ruth and her family, and Walter's family, and Perry and Harriet with Thomas, who was 6 and extremely interested in birthdays as a concept. On her plate, in a careful row, were 11 river stones, one from each person who had contributed to the collection over the years, chosen and placed with the specific gravity of people who understood what the language meant. Florence stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the 11 stones on her plate and felt the accumulated weight of all the kept promises, the ones she had been given and the ones she had given in return, and understood that this was what a life built correctly looked like. Not perfect. Not without the dark past, and the secrets and the difficult years, and the things that had to be survived, but built with honest hands and with the willingness to stay, to keep staying, one stone at a time, one kept promise at a time, for as long as the morning kept coming and the creek kept running and the stars kept being themselves above the Texas scrubland. Clarence came to stand beside her in the doorway. He put his hand at the small of her back, very lightly. "Happy birthday," he said. She looked at him, the face she knew completely. The man who had been standing on the boardwalk with his hat in his hand 20 years ago and who was standing here now with his hand at the small of her back, the same man, more so. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "All of it," he said, meaning the same 20 years she meant. "All of it," she confirmed. She crossed the kitchen to the table and picked up each stone in turn and held them and set them down again. Thomas, 6 years old and Perry's son, and therefore possessed of a serious streak that coexisted cheerfully with a 6-year-old's complete lack of dignity, came to stand beside her and watched what she was doing with great attention. "Grandmother," he said, with the formal address he had been taught to use, "why do we leave stones?" Florence looked down at him. Perry's eyes exactly. Clarence's eyes, the generation after Perry's generation, dark and careful and full of more than they showed. She crouched down to his level. "Because some things," she said, "are too important for words, and stones do not go anywhere, they stay where you put them." She put a stone in his small hand. "Do you understand?" Thomas looked at the stone. He looked at her. He closed his small hand around it. "A kept promise," he said, because Perry had told him that much. "A kept promise," Florence said. She stood up and looked at the room full of her family. This extravagant, improbable, river stone-collecting family that had built itself around her in the years since she had stepped off a stage in a small Texas town with 2 carpet bags and a careful distance from everything soft. And she thought that this was the ultimate answer to every hidden motive and every dark past and every forced choice and every moment of doubt. This kitchen, this morning, these people, this life. She put the stone in her pocket. Outside, the creek ran clear. The mesquite was greening. The stars had gone away with the night and would come back with it, as they always did. And in the barn, already at work in the early morning, a man with gray in his hair was singing a hymn in a genuine and unself-conscious baritone that carried across the warm spring air all the way to the kitchen window where his wife stood listening with her hand on the stones in her pocket. "I am still here. I have not gone anywhere. Small kept promise. Every last one."